אפשר גם לנסות שם.
שלום חברים. So I'm going to move to English. This panel, as published, will be held in
כפי שפורסם, המושב הזה יתקיים באנגלית, משום שזה מוקדש לחזון ולשאלות, ואולי גם לכיוונים, לתשובות של המהות של הכנס הזה.
As you know, the Jerusalem Conference for מסורתיות, can we translate that to traditionalism? It's a bit complicated.
Conference on מסורתיות. What is מסורתיות in English? Is it traditionalism? We'll try to translate it. My name is יקיר הראל.
Personally, this panel for me is also an opportunity to
יקיר
connect all
הראל,
my
ובאופן
different parts.
אישי,
Since my mother is an American
המושב
from
הזה
Connecticut.
הזדמנות בשבילי לחבר את כל החלקים של עצמי. אמא שלי אמריקאית מקונטיקט שעלתה בשנות ה-60. המשפחה של אבי עלו לכאן לפני כ-100 שנים מעיראק וכורדיסטן, ואני ישראלי שעשוי מחלקים רבים, והפאנל הזה היא הזדמנות בשבילי לחבר יחד את כל החלקים שלי למקום אחד. וזה למעשה הגעגוע והרצון המשותף שחוצה את הגבולות בין ישראל והתפוצות בארצות הברית והקהילות היהודיות בארצות הברית. מעבר להבדלים ולהגדרות, ברור שמסורתיות היא סצנה גדלה בישראל, ואנחנו ננסה לשאול את השאלות איך אפשר להתייחס גם לשאלות הגדולות שהקהילות היהודיות שואלות את עצמם, שאנשים יהודים שואלים את עצמם בארצות הברית היום.
But I think there is a shared longing
ואני חושב שיש געגוע ורצון משותף שרוצה להביא אותנו לכאן, למקום משותף כיחידים וגם כקהילות וגם כעם. מעבר לזרמים, משהו שמחובר מאוד להמשכיות היהודית, למסורת, לשורשים, לפרקטיקה, לדפוס החשיבה, וגם להרגשה שאנחנו מחוברים יחד כעם. ובשבילי המסורתיות והכנס הזה הם תשובה לתפילה אישית שלי, למרחב שיכול להכיל את התמונה הגדולה,
But again, different layers and
לא רק פרויקטים שונים, אלא גם רבדים שונים וזרמים שונים וממדים שונים.
That we feel also as individuals between traditionalism and modernity. ואנחנו
מרגישים כפרטים בין מודרניות לנצח, ואנחנו רוצים להיות מחוברים למשהו שמחבר אותנו עמוקות לעבר.
A specific denomination for that. So just a few words about the process that we did before.
התהליך שעברנו לפני הפאנל הזה, בפאנל הזה יהיו אנשים מאוד מעניינים, כפי שתשמעו, אלא התכנסנו אחרי השנה הראשונה של הכנס, והיה ברור שאנחנו יכולים לקיים כנס, ואי אפשר לדבר בכנס על מסורתיות, להתמקד רק בחברה הישראלית. יש הרבה אתגרים בישראל, אבל גם לחשוב על הקשר עם העם היהודי, ואולי, והאוכלוסייה הגדולה ביותר היא כמובן בארצות הברית, הם גם חלק, וכמובן החברה הישראלית והעם היהודי, ומה שמחבר את כולנו יחד. זאת ההתחלה, הפאנל הזה הוא ההתחלה של תהליך מתמשך עם שותפים נפלאים שזכינו שהצטרפו אלינו, וגם בחשיבה המשותפת שלנו תשמעו מחלק מהשותפים האלה, חלק הם היו חלק מהקבוצת חשיבה שהייתה לנו, אתם יכולים לקרוא על זה בחוברת שלנו, וזה לא רק דיון מעניין, ויהיו גם שאלות, תשובות, ועוד יותר חשוב, זה תהליך שיפתח את עינינו לפרספקטיבות חדשות, לנקודות מבט חדשות לגבי האתגרים היהודיים בישראל ומחוץ לישראל. ואחרי כל הדיבורים האלה, ולפני, יש לנו את המנחה של הפאנל, היא מנחה במוזיאון אנה, בית התפוצות לשעבר, מוזיאון העם היהודי, ואנחנו מאוד מודים לך שהצטרפת אלינו. היא מנהלת בית הספר הבינלאומי על שם קוראת ללימודי העם היהודי במוזיאון אנו, מוזיאון העם היהודי, ויושב איתנו הרב דניאל בוסקילה, ויש לנו גם חברים שנמצאים פה בחוף המזרחי בארצות הברית, ואנחנו מדמיינים את השותפים שלנו שם בחוף, המזרחי והקהילות שמה, ואנחנו רוצים להרגיש שאנחנו חלק ממשהו גדול יותר. אז אני רוצה לשיר ניגון קצר, אתם יכולים להצטרף אליי, ואם אתם שומעים אותי שם, גם כן, מיכל ויקיר ודניאל, אתם יכולים לשיר משם, וננסה לעשות כוונה קטנה לפני שאנחנו מתחילים. Once more. ונועם אדוני אלינו עלינו, מעשה ידינו כוננה עלינו, מעשה ידינו כוננהו. נעמה, הרב דניאל, בבקשה. נעמה. תכף נתחיל.
Hello everyone, ברוכים הבאים, welcome. So we're facing some sort of an unprecedented time in Jewish history. Because what defined us as a people, as community, as individuals was basically the non-Jews and even being persecuted. And this is what forced us to identify ourselves as a people. But we are, gladly, moving to a new era in history where we get the chance to define ourselves. Being Jewish is not a negative thing anymore. It can even be a positive or neutral sometimes. And in the foreseeing future, this is the way the world's going to look like. So no one is going to force us into our Judaism. And this actually challenges a lot of what defined Jewish continuity so far. This comes as a result from multiple trends, including assimilation, and I include growing secularization within this trend. Intermarriage, which is not the same anymore. Growing further away from the state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, and growing away apart from Jewish denominations and organizations and institutions outside of Israel. This is why what we used to know and what we used to do in order to secure belonging to the Jewish people is not going to work anymore. Even things that worked perfectly until 5 years ago, like Taglit, Israel education, etc., will not serve us the same way in the next coming years and in the future. So in order to secure the continuity of the Jewish people, we'll have to practice new mechanisms and new answers. So if what was working by default will not work anymore, when looking at this huge challenge that actually make it much harder for every Jewish institution in Israel and outside of it to keep doing what we do. So when we look at this challenge, there is one really interesting vintage answer, which we call מסורתיות. So we're here to examine together what kind of בשורה, what kind of an answer does מסורתיות have when we're looking at those challenges that are people-wide and globally spread. I have very good partners to investigate this question today. Rav Daniel Bosקילה. He's the international director of the Sephardic Educational Center. He has been worked as a Sephardic rabbi for over 30 years. He's currently translating the writings of Rav Uziel to English, and he's teaching and writing about Shai Agnon's work. He has found the time to come and be here with us. Thank you, Rav Daniel, and I invite you to present the rest of our group.
Thank you so much, Nahama. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to introduce my co-panelists, colleagues, and friends from the East Coast. I have to say this is a little bit of a strange tchusha. I'm forgetting my English. Strange feeling to be speaking English on a panel here in Yerushalayim. I usually have to make the switch, but okay. It's wonderful to be here. I want to thank first Meir Buzaglo and Tikkun for organizing this conference. It's a pleasure. And so I, came in from the West Coast. My panelists are from the East Coast. So in reality, I'm the only one, I think, who actually legitimately says, Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'sof marav. I come from the West Coast, and my heart is always here. And it's in the East in both places, because I have a daughter in New York, and I have a son here. So I have Mizrach of America and Mizrach of the world here. But my distinguished colleagues, I'm going to introduce them in no order of importance. They're all important and wonderful people. And I don't have really their formal biographies in front of me, so I'm just going to introduce them based on the wonderful work that they do. And they all have wonderful families. Michal Biton, I think, is doing groundbreaking work as a woman in the Jewish community, in the Jewish world, in the Sephardic world. She comes from a very distinguished Sephardic background. She's an intellectual. She's worked on the history of the Syrian Sephardic communities. I think she finished her PhD, and she's also working with Hartman. And she had the time, in addition to being a mother, to also opening her own kehillah. And she's the Rosh Kehillah of a very, very successful, unique model in New York, the downtown kehillah. Is that what it's called, right? I'm correct, Michal? It's the downtown kehillah.
The downtown Minyan.
Okay, downtown Minyan. Thank you. So Michal Biton is going to be one of our panelists. Next is, and I know Michal, I've met Michal many times, as well as another New Yorker, Rabbi Rouly Mטלון. Rouly Mטלון also comes from a very unique background, blending the Sephardic world and the world of what in Hebrew has become known as, Hatnuah HaMasortiyot, the conservative movement, but he really is much beyond the denominationalism. And he is the rabbi of one of the most outstanding and unique synagogues in New York City, Bnei Jeshurun. And if you've never been to that synagogue, we just celebrated Sukkot a few weeks ago, and we had Simchat Bet HaShoeva. The Talmud says, "Mi shelo ra'a simchat bet hashoeva, lo ra'a simcha miyamav. Mi shelo ra'a kabbalat Shabbat at Bnei Jeshurun, lo ra'a simcha biyamav, lo ra'a kabbalat Shabbat miyamav." It's an incredible experience. He's a scholar, a wonderful community leader, and we're thrilled that he's also part of the panel. Acharon Chaviv, Ykir Aenglander, who I have not had the chance to meet personally, but I hope to soon, is a scholar, he has a PhD from Hebrew University, he's a theologian, and he works with, I think, one of the most unique and new developments, Dafka sitting here in Israel and talking about something that developed that I was eyewitness to see over my years in Los Angeles for the last 30 years. The development of something which once upon a time in Israel was looked down upon. There were all sorts of derogatory terms. Israelis who leave Israel to go live elsewhere were called Yodim, Bogdim, all sorts of things. Hopefully, like Na'ama says, we're kind of beyond those stereotypes, and these are people that lived here and found their lives elsewhere, and now are seeking an identity as Israeli Americans. They don't want to give up the Israeli. They have children born in the United States who grew up with Hebrew, and they created something called the IAC, the Israeli American Council. It has branches all over the United States, very successful in trying to develop a Jewish hybrid, a hybrid of a Jewish and an Israeli identity for these communities, of which are quite numerous in the diaspora in the United States. And Dr. Ykir Aenglander is in charge of the entire division of the IAC that deals with Zehut Yehudit, with Jewish identity for Israelis, which is a very again, what's the word in English for? I'm forgetting which language I'm speaking it. Zemeod Murkav. It's a very complex issue to be an Israeli in the United States. So that's what he deals with. And these are our distinguished panelists that I'm privileged to be part of with them. And with that, let's go.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with our first question. I wanted to ask you guys, and Michal, you'll go first. Does Messortiyut exist outside of Israel? When we're talking about Messortiyut outside of the borders of this country, what are we talking about in fact? Michal, bevakasha.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Na'ama. Thank you, Rabbi Bosקילה. It's really great to be here. I'm excited to be part of this Yerushalayim panel all the way from New York. I'll just start off by giving a bit of the perspective that I bring with me. I was Argentina, up in a Moroccan, Syrian, and Spanish family. And my family moved to the United States when I was a teenager. Here, I very quickly realized that a lot of the Jewish communities that I was going into were Ashkenazi and American communities, had a very different type of Judaism than the one that I grew up with and that I was used to in Sephardic communities. Eventually, I made my way to do research about these communities, and I decided to do my PhD studying the Syrian Jewish community in New York. Since then, I end up doing right now a research study project of studying Sephardic communities across America. So we're going to be studying Persian communities, Syrian communities, Egyptian, Bukharian, all kinds of communities. And Na'ama, I would say that these communities represent and reflect a Massortiyut, a traditionalism that is very old. It's not something that emerged recently, it's something that they brought with them from their home communities all the way to America right now. A different way of saying this is that Massortiyut is a Jewish way of approaching our tradition, and the Massortiyut developed both in Israel and also all around the world. So we can talk about American Jewish Massortiyut, we can talk about Israeli Massortiyut, and we can look at the differences between them. The other thing I would say here is, as you're going to hear from the other panelists, even in the American context, there are different definitions and different understandings about what Massortiyut is. When I describe the Massortiyut, the traditionalism of Sikh communities from the Middle East and North Africa, I'm talking about a Massortiyut that is deeply, deeply tied to their country of origins, that is deeply tied to a collective identity, to a sense of we. When you said, Na'ama, that that there's been a lot of assimilation and changes and things like that, the communities that are doing everything in their capacities to maintain a certain traditionalism that was theirs, and they are finding new mechanisms in this context to maintain them. So 100%, there is traditionalism, there is Massortiyut all around the world, because it's not something that exists, that was born in Israel. I think what we have to be especially grateful to Israel for is that there's been researchers and leaders in Israel who've begun to use the language of Massortiyut and to describe it and to explain what it is. So that's a little bit of like a brief statement, just saying that there's specifically Sephardic Middle Eastern communities around. Each of them exhibit a form of Massortiyut. It's a little bit different than the one in Israel because of the context. And I'm excited to continue discussing this in the next questions.
תודה. הרב רולי?
Shalom Aleichem. Good to be with all of you. It's the first time, Rav Daniel, that I was introduced as a New Yorker, first time in my life. In fact, I also have a biography, I think, that determines where I stand and also the nature of my work. I was born and grew up in Argentina within the Syrian community, but also with participation in a conservative congregation that had a large participation of Saradim, Syrians and Moroccans and people from Turkey and the Balkans. And then I came to the United States, to New York, where I studied at the Center of Conservative Judaism, Jewish Theological Seminary, and ended up in a conservative Ashkenazic congregation. But I felt that that was a little bit too narrow, and wanted to expand a little bit, bring some of the Sephardic spirit and traditions. And I believe that I live in my work within the spirit of Massortiyut. I don't know if this is one could say that there is Massortiyut in America today in an expansive way, but I think that there are many spaces, Jewish spaces in America, that are looking to root themselves deeply in tradition. I think people are very thirsty for a connection to the tradition at the same time as they wrestle with the challenges of modernity. A way to integrate tefillah, a prayer, ritual, a meaningful and a serious approach to halakha, inclusive and diverse approach to community. I think also the spirit of moderation and the spirit of tolerance I think all these elements together also, of course, with the pursuit of social justice, I think the integration of all of these aspects is something that is growing, I think, within the American Jewish community, at least within many spaces now, trying to bring together all these things. And I think that's the spirit of Masורתיות. I think that we are all interested in promoting and expanding. I will stop here and pass it on to Ykir.
Thank you so much, and it's a real gift to be here. I would like to focus on one element of מסורתיות, and it's one of the roles of what does it mean to have a מסורת. So I think that one of these unique roles is that מסורת help community to live without the need all the time to invent itself again and again and again. I mean, one of the most popular, at least in America, one of the words that is most popular in business, in life, with community, is the word community. Everyone wants to have a community. But to make a community, it's really hard. And the Masoret, it's a tool in order that the community, the people together, will be bigger than its numbers. It's the gestalt that holds them together. And then I need to ask myself, as an Israeli American, as someone who working with ISC, how we help a community of the Israeli Americans, that it's around 600 to 800,000 members, when we speak about the third generation of immigration and the children, the partners, how we make us to be one community, how we unite together the Israeli American community in Philadelphia, in San Diego, in New York, etc., etc. And the main question that we are asking is, can we use our Israeliness to be the source of this community? Okay, so this is the main question that I'm asking myself. Now, to say that Israeliness will be the Masoret of the Israeli American community can sound that something doesn't work well. And I think it's because of the image that many, at least Israelis, we carry towards Israeli Americans, that there is question around Yordim. Like, can you have a Zionist, a vibrant Zionist and Hebrew culture outside of Israel? It's a good question. And I think that in the past decade or 20 years, we see the change around the role of immigration in general in the world, and also around the Israeli American. So today, the Israeli Americans, we are a vibrant community with deep relationship to Israel, with deep relationship that it's growing with the American Jewish community. The Israeli American community in many ways protect the state of Israel in America in many ways, and protect us and the American Jewish community against anti-Semitism. And I think that together we create our Masoret. I want to end with a question that we are asking ourselves on daily life, which is how we make sure that the Israeli American Masoret tradition is not going to be too harsh on the one hand, how we make sure that the first immigrant community is not going to become too Haredi in a way, like too strict about what does it mean to be Israeli, because of the next generation who is born and grow up in America, they need different kind of Israeliness. So this is part of the question we are asking. Thank you.
So for me, I'm going to frame this. Hello? Yeah. This conversation for me is both personal and professional, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And I also want to talk about the fact that when I shared this conference and the fact that I was going to be coming here to be part of this with American friends and with people in my community, the majority of them did not understand what we meant by מסורתיות, traditionalism. And I'm going to say something which may be a little bit provocative, but it's good to provoke some thinking. I personally cannot separate Mas'oltiyut from Sfaradiyut. I can't. To me, when I talk about Mas'oltiyut, it automatically means Sephardic tradition. When I came to work for the organization that I'm currently working for now, for the past 12 years, the Sephardic Educational Center, Hamerkaz HaChinuchi HaSfaradi, one of the first discussions that many board members had was we should change the name and remove the term Sephardic. Why? It's limiting. People think it's only for Sfaradim. It's separatist. And we discussed that. And I sat down and wrote a paper redefining for the 21st century what the term Sephardic means. I don't think it has anything to do any longer with ethnicity, because otherwise, what are my children? I'm from a Sephardic background. My wife is Ashkenazi. What does that make my kids, or many of your kids probably, and many of the kids here in this country? So Sfaradiyut, or Mas'oltiyut Sfaradit, to me, is a model for a way of living for the Jewish people. We'll discuss that as another question. But I don't, and I think Mas'oltiyut, as we're discussing it, the traditionalism, was once what we would call in Hebrew Nachalat HaKlal, Sfaradim and Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazim decided to change it with denominationalism, which I don't think did good for the Jewish people. I really don't. I think when you study the overall history of Orthodoxy, modern Orthodoxy, ultra-Orthodoxy, conservative, reform, redefining themselves every 5-10 years, that's why in the United States today there are a lot of young people who say we're non-denominational, we're post-denominational. Certainly my parents, when they came from Morocco and Algeria, never heard of those terms. I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California, where I live today. And I grew up in a home that I would define as French, Moroccan, Algerian, American, Sephardic, Jewish. My first language is French. I didn't know English till I was 5 or 6 years old. I learned Hebrew and English simultaneously in school. And it was a hybrid identity. But I never, ever heard the denominational terms in my home. My parents would watch programs about rabbis, and they didn't say these were Orthodox rabbis or conservative rabbis on television. If Heschel spoke, my father, who was from Marrakesh, said, he's a modern rabbi. He's not conservative or reform or Orthodox. We never heard of those terms. So for me personally, the Judaism that's being discussed at this wonderful conference is the model that I grew up with in my home. It's the Judaism that I was raised with in the United States. There was no big community of people that lived that way. We were a minority of people who were able to have the Bet Knesset and larger life as part of our lives. And so personally, I've grown up with this. Personally, my wife and I have raised our children. Most importantly, we've raised them in this Mas'olti way without ever using denominational terminology. And professionally, I've tried to represent this Judaism not as sometimes I hear with some colleagues in Israel as like an in-between middle position. But I think it's a wonderful position, as we say in the Gemara, lechatchila. I would educate young people to grow up and to be Masoltim. A lot of my colleagues believe that it's better than nothing, but it's not ideal. You always want to get them to become more observant. I'm not necessarily of that philosophy. That's a pipe dream of some individuals, but it's proven to not be accurate to the community. So I think the Sephardic traditionalism of acceptance, of tolerance, and understanding that Sephardic Judaism does not mean where we're born, but it's a hashkafat olam, it's a way of life that applies to all Jews. And that's why I use the term classic Sephardic Judaism or Sephardic traditionalism. When people ask me, or when I'm identified, or when I'm introduced by people, they say, he graduated from Yeshiva University, he's an Orthodox rabbi. And I say, no. I'm going to quote, I'll conclude on this note. There's a wonderful rabbi here in Yerushalayim, David Menachem. And he said something once which I thought was really fantastic. He wrote in Hebrew, he said, how do you say the word orthodox in Hebrew? How do you say it in Hebrew? Orthodoxy, right? That's a good Hebrew word. And he said, in Hebrew, he says, I think that when my grandparents came from Iraq to this country, if somebody would have walked up to my grandfather and said, Haimata orthodoxy, are you orthodoxy? He would have answered, Lo ani margish beseder, akol beseder, like I feel okay. It sounds like, what are these terms that, you know, we're talking about a 3,000-year-old tradition, and we use terms that are 150 years old. So to me, this is what Masotiyut is. It's linked. The Sfaradim have continued this. Ashkenazim broke with it.
Rav Daniel, you remind me that my 3.5-year-old girl was asked, what is Masortiim? So she answered, Marokkaim.
She's
That's
right.
the right answer, right? She's
100% right. And I'm Moroccan. I'm proud of that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everyone. So we've learned that Masotiyut outside of Israel would usually refer to something pre-denominational. The denominations we know today were designed in an Ashkenazi world, so it does not apply. It's not even relevant to Sephardic, to Masorti Judaism outside of Israel. We've learned that we're talking about some combinations of hybrid identities, some that can often overlooked when we're talking about the Jewish people outside of Israel, but it definitely exists. And we talked about a very natural, a very easygoing connection to the identity of the people who would find themselves in a Masorti environment or activity, etc. So I'm going to move next to our second question, but beforehand, in a minute, you, from the audience, will have the opportunity to direct questions to our speakers. But because of the tech issue, we need it written down on a little note, on a zetele. So if you want to give us a question, this is the time. And if you need a note and a pen, just raise your hand, and I think Sivan can help you with that, and bring it to us. We'll ask it after the next question. The next question I want to ask you is, what are the similarities and differences between Masortiyut within Israel and outside of Israel? What is common and what is actually very much different, and we have to take it into consideration when we're trying to talk about the same phenomenon? So, Ykir, would you please be the first to open this question?
Well, thank you for this question. I think it's such an important one. I will go back to the Israeli-American community. In my first answer, I focus on Israeliness as an essence. Can it be an essence for a Masoret? What I'm going to focus now on is, as you ask this question, is on something that the Israeli-American community must do as we are making our home in America. And I want to start by sharing something that Aleph Bet Yehoshua says. And he said that to be an Israeli in Israel, all what you're doing is part of your Israeli Jewish identity, right? I mean, you are living, let's say, in Ashdod or in Yerushalayim, you go to a restaurant that's called Tmol Shilshom, which is in, I don't know, Hamelitz or another Narkis street. You read the menu in Hebrew, and then you pay with shekel, that it's a coin from the time of the Mishnah and Talmud. When you come to America, for us, the Israeli-American, the third generation of immigrants can fall to the trap that this identity is enough. What we needed to understand, and here it's different, that for the generation who is growing up here in America, this identity will never be enough. It's too thin. Because even if they know perfect Hebrew, and they can sing the song, let's say, Shamarei Golan, they don't have the visceral understanding of what's the Golan. They come to visit once a year, or twice, or a few times every few years, but it's not visceral as it is for someone in Israel. And therefore, and now I'm going to say something hard, we need also to be Jewish outside of our Israeli identity. Now, for many Israelis, and many of the Israeli-American community grow up in Israel as secular, and I don't like this word. In a way, to be Jewish is to be an Orthodox. Because both sides, the Chiloni side, the secular side, and the religious side in Israel agree that to be Jewish many times, and this is why this conference in the Masorti is so important, It's the other side of the mirror. And this is what we need to change. And I think that this is a gift that many Israeli Americans, when we move to America, we feel that for the first time, we can be Jews by choice. We can choose to study Gemara and not to worry from the cousin who is going to ask me, oh, niyeta chozer b'tshuva, you become, which means you become Orthodox. And I think that's something that, and we do it now for a few years, and I want to end and to say that when I see the amount, for example, of women today, Israeli Americans, who are becoming rabbis or cantors, and they just feel at home with that. When I see the young generation, when I see in our programs of Eitanim or Keshet that they speak their Israeli Jewish, and they don't need to worry if I can put kippah for one side or if I'm a girl and putting kippah, everything is fine. And this phenomena is a phenomena that we get from our American Jewish brothers and sisters. And it's something that we are adding to our Israeli American, to our Israeli poet.
Thank you. Michal.
Thanks, Na'ama. I think I'll start off in something that's a little bit similar to what Ykir started saying. The main difference in terms of Israel and America and how traditionalism manifests in each of them, to me, has to do 100% with the public square. In Israel, you have a public square that in many ways is traditional, is Masorati. You have names of ancestors and rabbis in the streets. You have, bus drivers that say Shabbat Shalom. You have all kinds of things that are constantly reminding you that you have a past and that you're part of a collective. In America, I would say the gravitational forces are completely different. I want to actually read to you right now. Yesterday on the subway in Manhattan, I saw an ad on the subway for a company that delivers food to you, okay? And it said like this. It said, it's like getting grandma soup, marak mesavta, without the when are you having kids? Okay, that's the advertisement. You can ask them to get you food, but without grandma bothering you and asking you questions. And when I saw this, I was a little bit in shock because it represents some of the rupture that I think exists in American society, in which tradition is just like a knowing voice in your shoulder that's like asking you nudnik questions instead of like a source of respect and admiration and honor and something that we want to continue. So America, I would say the gravitational forces push you towards a hyper-individualism. They push you away from a certain understanding towards Masoret. Because of this difference in the public square in Israel and in America, I believe that in America, traditionalism exists much more within a community, betoch keilah. When Yaakov Yadgar, who's a scholar who studies Masורתיות in Israel, when he speaks about Masורתיות in an Israeli context, for example, he speaks about the home and the public square. When I was reading that and applying it to the Sephardic communities in America, I thought, oh, we have another layer here. We have a community. We have especially Sephardic Jews that came from the Middle East. They live in a similar neighborhood to each other. They have their own synagogues. They have their own schools. They have their own social welfare agencies. They have a very potent sense of collective we. And you can argue that it's both something that the American state has allowed for in the way that it exists. And I would argue even further that the forces of liberalism in America necessitate this. You need a communal structure in order to be able to cultivate a thick and strong Masortiyut. Now, of course, this comes with a lot of opportunities and challenges. And I'll just end with the following. When I think about Masortiyut, Masorati Sephardic communities from the Middle East and North Africa in America, I think that they are constantly faced with challenges from two directions. They're on the one hand trying to guard against the individualizing forces of American liberalism. On the other hand, they're constantly engaged with Orthodoxy and Haredi Judaism. And that's also a very strong temptation that's actually begun to really shape. We have our own phenomenon here of becoming Haredi, of national Sephardi communities. So it's a very fragile ecosystem, and it operates, I would say, just facing different dynamics than what Masortiyut faces in Israel.
Thank you. Rav Daniel.
Yeah. So To pick up on what Michal just said, when we talk about Massortiyut, and I use the term Sephardic Massortiyut, or in English, I always use the term classic Sephardic Judaism. People ask me, why classic Sephardic Judaism, not just Sephardic Judaism? And I think it goes to what Michal said, because what's happened even to Sfaradim, especially in Israel, is that there's either this extremism of Sfaradim Chilonim or Sfaradim Charedim. Neither of those models existed in the countries where Sfaradim came from. There was no such thing as the phenomenon of the Eastern European ultra-Orthodoxy that's become very, very much an expression and a voice here in the state of Israel. That was always strange to my father when we went to Sephardic synagogues in Los Angeles, and Sephardic rabbis from Israel were coming to speak, dressed in black garb and black coats, and not only dressed that way, but thinking that way. So I agree with Michal that that's something that a lot of Sephardic communities that are trying to hold on to Massortiyut and to their tradition are facing that complexity. And if I have to answer the question about the difference between the United States and Israel, so I'll answer it in a little bit of an interesting way. For 42 years, the organization that I proudly head, the Sephardic Educational Center, has been running Masorti communities in Israel. What do I mean by that? Every summer, we have kids coming from all over the world to spend 1 month to 6 weeks at our center in the old city of Jerusalem and traveling all over Israel. In the last decade, I renamed that program to give it a Sephardic flavor. I named it Chamsa Yisrael. I just led a group like that this summer. I've led 8 or 10 of those groups over the years. I've worked with them in the 90s and here as well. What I love about those groups is that the way we live Judaism, we create a community, albeit for a month or 6 weeks. But what I love about it is that it confuses Israelis and it confuses Americans. Israelis don't understand and can't figure out if they want to spend even half a day with our group. Some Israelis are shocked that they'll see we wake up every morning and have tefillah. And then we may go swimming with boys and girls together. And then we may have another tefillah, and then the girls are wearing pants and we're all hiking together. And we're talking about Judaism, and we're living a modern life at the same time. We keep Shabbat, but we have a very different understanding sometimes of, the ultra-Orthodox interpretations of keeping Shabbat. The flexibility within the Sephardic tradition is the Masorti community that we live. American Jews, the other groups that are here for the summer, they see our group and they say, I don't understand. Is this an Orthodox group? Because it prays every morning, but I see girls wearing shorts and the boys and girls can go swimming. And conservative or reform groups will say, they, seem very flexible, but wow, they have a lot of prayer and they're very strict about Shabbat. That's Masortiyut. It's not really something we could define on paper, even though we've tried to in the last several months, right? Because we don't live within those strict boundaries, the boxes that Israeli society has created, Dati, Chiloni, the either or the boxes of denominations that American Judaism has created.
Toda. Arav רולי.
Thank you. I want to start by making a comment on something you said, Na'ama, that the Massortiyut is pre-denominational. I think it's also post-denominational, in the sense that for me it's an aspiration. That once some people leave denominations, the maslul, the path that is so narrow of the denomination, that we can be open to this spirit of Massortiyut post-denomination, not just pre. With respect to the difference, I want to pick up on something that Michal said about the absence, of course, of Judaism here in the public square. And because of that, all of our Judaism is contained within the community. I mean, people come they cannot find it in the street, but they find it within the bounds of the community, of the Kehillah, of the Beit Knesset. And that's the place that contains everything from ritual to prayer to Shabbat to the connection with Israel to chesed to the aspiration for tzedek chevrati, for social justice, for volunteering, all the activities that are the expression of Jewish values and Jewish practice are done within the context of the kehillah. It's the container, and each group, each kehillah, each bet knesset is a container of all these elements, these Jewish elements of connection to the tradition and also of facing the challenge of modernity. That's one thing. The other difference between, of course, there's great variety in terms of Jewish identity and Jewish expression here as there is in Israel, but here we don't have a Rabbanut Rashit. We don't have a central rabbinate that is privileged. The privilege is one type of one form of Judaism. Everybody here, ish ayashab beinav yaseh, everybody can live their Judaism as they please. You want to be Reform, you want to be secular, you want to be conservative, you want to be Orthodox. So everybody can do it in their own way. At the same time, everybody's in their own maslul. Everybody's in their own path. You either are Orthodox or conservative or Reform or secular, or you're unaffiliated, or you're part of the traditional Sephardic community, but you are within that path. It's very, very unlikely that you're going to, very few people cross those boundaries to pray, to observe Shabbat, to have communal celebrations. It's unless you have family somewhere else. Usually you stay within your own denominational boundaries. And paradoxically, something that doesn't happen so much in Israel is that the leaders or members of all these different, particularly leaders of all these different denominations, we have a very free and open exchange. We have, in our neighborhood here, there's a lot of Jewish congregations and schools and organizations of all sorts of different approaches and expressions and streams, and we all get along together. Orthodox, Reform, we all speak with each other, we are all friendly, we all support each other, we're on the panels together. Some congregations take trips together to Israel, Orthodox, Reform, conservative. So there is, although most people stay within the lines, at the same time, there is collaboration between these different streams. And what I find sometimes lacking, which I find in Israel, but I find less here, is people who are, what we say, fall between a kisaot, who are in between. The phenomenon of people who are who have more of a hybrid Jewish identity is, I think, less of a phenomenon here, and I think that's what Masורתיות could bring in here, is to create a space, of where people can embody or express these different aspects of Jewish life and Jewish identity.
I'd like to comment, it's a little bit so strange because none of us are actually in the same place, so there's not that much interaction between us, but I do want to actually say something regarding what my dear friend Rabbi Mטלון, רולי, what he just said. And I want to speak about you specifically and what you do. Because when I first heard about Bnei Jeshurun, it's not, identified as an Orthodox synagogue. And I went there on a Friday night with a group of kids from my Sephardic synagogue. I wanted to expose them to the different expressions of Judaism in New York. And I took them to Bnei Jeshurun Friday night. They had never been to a service like this with music, and they were fascinated. It was beautiful. And then I think like the next afternoon, we went to Mincha in a Moroccan, Sephardic, quote-unquote, Orthodox synagogue. And who did I bump into there? Rabbi Rouly Mטלון. And it wasn't something that I was accustomed to see somebody who presides over what's identified as a non-Orthodox synagogue coming to pray in a Moroccan synagogue. And I didn't know Rouly very well. And then I went back to New York, and it was during the month of Elul, and I went to Slichot somewhere, and I see him there again. And some people might not like that I'm going to say this, but my answer to all this is because his last name is Mטלון. He's Sephardic. And Sephardim, I think, have sometimes the ability, once upon a time, to branch out and to be part of the whole world. You know, I don't exclusively study Rabbi Uziel. I love Shai Agnon. People will tell me, Malecha with a Sofer Ashkenazi. The Sephardic world was always all embracing. And I think that's the message that Massortiyut Sfaradit could bring to the Jewish world, is to embrace one another and work together.
This is our next question, but you took some of the time already. So just to sum it up, we've talked about the differences. There are multiple differences between Massortiyut in Israel and outside of Israel, one of which is there is no country to direct the activities of people. They're not forced to get married under any framework, so they can choose. It's a complete choice, which also maybe enables these collaborations between different communities and denominations, as Rabbi Mטלון was describing. Secondly, the public square, the public sphere that creates identity is not Jewish, like in Israel. So again, they have to work harder. They have to actively choose their Jewish identity, but it comes with bigger freedom, which is also a blessing to the Masorti movement and communities. Thirdly, Masorti people outside of Israel has to lean on institutions and on communities. That's the container, unlike in Israel, when you can more easily become an individual Masorti. And regarding similarities, you were describing the flexibility that Massortiyut, Masorti identity, is holding, unlike, I think you said it's opposed to Ashkenazi Orthodoxy. So these are the differences and similarities you guys were describing in the last couple of minutes. And I'm going to move on to our next question. This is the very last call for questions from the audience. You can write it on a little note and give it to us, and we'll try to refer to it. So my last questions to you, honorable speakers, is what is the bsora? What is the big answer that Massortiyut holds when we're looking at the Jewish people today, at the current challenges, at current opportunities? Where can we take the richness and relevancy of Massortiyut in favor of the entire Jewish people, not just inside Israel, but worldwide? And Michal, would you please go first?
Thank you, Na'ama. There's a bit of an echo though, if we can, okay. Before responding to the question about the Besora, I do just want to, if it's okay, just clarify two things quickly that I think it's important to name right now. One of them is, and I'm saying this as something that could be a much longer conversation at a different time, but one of them is that part of what allowed Sephardic communities from the Middle East and North Africa to establish flourishing traditional communities in the US is also they didn't have to deal with discrimination from general society for many years. And I think that's actually important to kind of learn and ask, how could Sephardic Mizrahi communities develop in different ways if they didn't have obstacles that were imposed upon them and if they weren't viewed differently by others. So that's just one thing to note that I think is an important discussion. The second thing, and this I might maybe disagree a little bit with Rabbi Bosקילה, and it's good to disagree, l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heavens. When I think about Massortiyut, I see it has different strains and different forms. There are some forms of Massortiyut that are flexible and open-minded and inclusive. Massortiyut also includes strains that are deeply rigid and socially conservative, and that can be more closed off. So I think that we, at least from the place that I'm sitting, we need to look at different transfigurations in terms of how these communities have evolved and how Massortiyut could kind of lean into different places. In terms of the Besora, and I'll say this very quickly, for me, the most important Besora that Massortiyut brings, especially for Jews in the US right now, is that it allows a way for us to think about communities and relationships that are not only based on ideological and political agreement. There's so much polarization right now in our American communities. I know in Israel also, the elections are coming up, but people will often not share a Shabbat meal a synagogue, and won't be in like a WhatsApp chat with family members who vote differently than them and who just disagree ideologically. I think Masorati communities in which we learn about what it means to have a common shared practice, to speak about we, about belonging, about collectivity, about solidarity, and in which we don't ask you, what do you believe in when you walk in the door and when we welcome you and when we embrace you? That kind of ingredients from Masortiyut, the privilege, a sense of belonging and being in deep relationship with each other, even when we disagree, those ingredients, I think, are the most powerful Besorah that are precious and treasured and important for our communities right now.
Thank you, Michal. Rabbi רולי Mטלון.
I agree 100% with Michal, and I would just expand what she said. I think that the Besorah here, the good news about the Masortiyut, is the possibility of having a form of Judaism that is integrative, that integrates tradition, Shabbat, kashrut, a concern for Jewish practice, social justice, all these things, connection with Israel, all these things, hold them together as, I think which is one of the great principles of Masortiyut, is that sense of wholeness, of wholesomeness, Judaism that is rich, that integrates, that brings together, and also brings together people, as Michal was saying, that is tolerant, that is not exclusive, but is tolerant, that is moderate, that is non-judgmental, and that is balanced. I think that's the great that's one of the great opportunities that Masortiyut offers. Often we have here. I think Meir Buzaglo said it last year in the introduction to the first Congress. You don't have to be an Orthodox Jew to love Torah or to love Shabbat. You don't have to be a lefty to care about social justice, and so on and so forth. I think that's the great opportunity of Masortiyut is to bring all these things together. They belong to all of us, not just to some of us.
תודה. יקיר, בבקשה.
Thank you so much. Something about myself. I had the gift, huge gift in my life, that I grow up in Bnei Brak in a Hasidic family. But Baruch Hashem, that I also had the courage for myself, only for myself, to live. To live with two identities, when it's not contradict each other, is to live with complexity. And complexity is a Besorah. In a second, I can move and I can sing here with a Yiddish accent, Koyechsov. And in a second, the same natural way, I can speak in my academic voice. And I think that the Besorah, the gift that the Israeli-American community is working to give, is that we speak naturally both languages. We speak Hebrew or Ivriyut, and we speak mostly our native generation who grow up here in America, they speak fluent American. And we need, instead of fighting around this identity, and Michal, thank you so much for emphasizing that Masortiyut can be also a rigid thing. And I see it with Israelis. No, everything should be only in Hebrew, on Yom HaZikaron. What, you're going to translate, אנחנו הילדים של 73? No way. So we cannot be Haredi in that way. But when we bring both, the complexity becomes Sulam Yaakov, the ladder of Yaakov. This is a role that I see of our Israeli-American community. On the one hand, we can translate to our families in Israel how Judaism can be an act of choice. When our relatives are coming constantly to America, we now emphasize not only to take them to shopping or to the incredible nature of America, but bring them to see a woman who is a rabbi, to see Michal, to go to Bnei Yeshurun. This is part of our mission. But also, when something happened in Israel, in a military operation, or when there is a critique of Israel, but not in a fair way, but with anti-Semitism, we are the first on the street. This is our miluim. From the other side, there is a gift that we bring to many American Jews, and I think mostly to the young generation of American Jews. We all speak about the gap between Israel and American Judaism. But one of the reasons why many young generation of American Jews become far from Israel is what we call in psychology, they don't have somatic experience of Israel. In order to love a place, you need to feel the place with your body. And it's hard to do it when you came maybe once in your life to Israel. So birthright can be the act, you know, the first date when you have amazing first date and you have a crush on someone. But crush is not love. You need to continue to feed the seeds of the Israeliness to American Jews. And I think that in many ways, and we see it with our programs and our mission and work, the Israeli-American community is a somatic, like really bodily, visceral experience for many American Jews who choose to live with us because by us, they can experience Israel in United States.
Thank you, Ykir.
Na'ama, can I just say something from what Ykir said, just because I think it's good to note? Ykir just called me a rabbi. I happen to lead a community in New York. I'm not a rabbi, though. I'm Rosh Keilah. And the reason I'm naming this is that when we're speaking about different dynamics of traditionalism, there's still a lot of constraints that occur in traditional communities, especially for women who want to have different leadership roles. So it's actually a good example for both the traditionalism that inspires me and also the way that it takes different forms in different places.
Toda, Michal. That was actually a fascinating example. Rav Daniel.
I think on that point that Michal is making, one of the serious problems in defining traditionalism is the belief that traditionalism is a synonym for mimicry of the past. I don't think it's the role of a Moroccan synagogue in the 21st century in Los Angeles to mimic the sociology of Marrakesh that my father grew up with. If we want to call it a traditional Moroccan synagogue, then that means tunes, customs, food, culture. But Rav Uziel, who was not Moroccan, but I'm talking about Sfaradim in general, in his introduction to Mishpatei Uziel, his work of halacha, he said, what does it mean to look at halacha? We have to look not only at changes in technology and medicine and science, which everybody talks about, but he said, shinuyei arachim, changes in values. So did Rav Uziel agree to have women serve on a bet din? No. That was not the sociology of his time. Although remember, he was the one who did push for women to vote in this country, where the great spiritual leader Rav Kook was actually deeply opposed to it. That's a very famous thing that's been written about. But I think if Rav Uziel came back today and said, why are you holding on to this mimicry? You're in the 21st century. Values have changed. I think that's Sephardi Masotiyut, where the Sephardic tradition's halachic viewpoint was always flexible. Rav Chaim David Halevi said, "En gmishut ke gmishuta shel halacha." Halacha should be flexible. Halacha is a language for our communities. But if we're only reacting to what others might say and look over our shoulders and say, I don't want to use this title and I don't want to be called this or do that, lest they say, then all we're doing is a masotiyut that's mimicking the past because we're afraid of being boxed and being denominationalized. And I think it takes guts. We have to be brave in believing really what we stand for and saying, let's move this conversation to the next level and not be afraid to have women rabbis in the Sephardic tradition, in the Sephardic world, and not be afraid to make breakthroughs in halacha Like, remember what happened here? I know we're on Zoom now, but remember 2 years ago, Zoom became, in 1 week, a very controversial term. Remember? Psak HaZoom, Pesach, the Seder, can you use Zoom, and so on. I was branded as the biggest reform rabbi in the United States because I signed that. Here I was called Reformi because I come from a modern community. And in the United States, I was called Reform because I signed a psak that said you could use Zoom on Pesach. But I believe that that was a moment of truth of what Mas'oltiyut meant, that we looked at the larger picture of the needs of the community and blended that into halacha. That's been the way of life, the Sfaradim. That's a language that's been lost. That's why it was so controversial. So I think the Bsorah is to look at the philosophy of what Sfaradim represented once upon a time and to apply that to many problems that are plaguing this country. Giyul, conversion, and so on. There's a long list of things that Mas'oltiyut could help solve here if we were given the power and the language and the tools to do so.
Thank you, Rav Daniel. So I'm going to try and sum up some of the very beautiful ideas you guys shared with us. So you see Mas'oltiyut as relevant when we're facing, as an antidote to the growing polarization. It represents some sort of interactive identity that can be balanced and not judgmental. It embraces complexity, complex identities, which also allows hybrid identity and bridge communities to exist. It bears a bsorah to Israelis outside of Israel that cannot lean on Orthodox identity and not on Israel itself, so Mas'oltiyut can be a good answer as a new basis for the identity. And it can also talk about how can we change our values, our very own DNA, in order to bring it and to maintain its relevancy in current times. Rav Daniel, we're going to share a couple of questions now, and then our speakers will have 1 minute each to try and answer whatever they choose, and then we're going to move to sum up this very interesting panel. Rav Daniel.
So I should ask a question. Okay. So what organizations or leaders outside of the Sephardi world could be partners or allies in this approach? You don't want me to answer that question. Because
in a minute you're going to answer. Just give us the question.
Okay. So the question is what organizations or leaders outside of the Sephardic world could be partners or allies in this approach? I don't know if that means in Israel or in general. Another question is there any possibility for a cooperation between Jews and Arab Muslims in the United States? Okay. And another question is, are we referring to Yemenite communities when we mean Sfaradim?
Maybe you can answer first, and then we're going to move it.
Answer which one? All of them?
Whatever you choose.
Okay. So
just skip it to 1 minute.
Yeah. So I think when we talk about organizations, I think, again, today there are several leaders, my distinguished colleagues, and there are others who are willing to branch out and to think beyond the world of denominationalism. Most of American Jewry is not there, Sfaradim or Ashkenazim. Sfaradim, sadly, because of the influence of what Sfaradiyut has become here. Sfaradim means, when I come here to Israel and people say, Hamelkaza Sfaradi, they say, you can't be Sfaradi, you don't look like Shas. That's become the narrative in this country. So I think anybody who wants to branch out of this box thinking has a seat at this table, not just our table on this panel, but at this kenes to try to work together to bring this bsorah. So I think anybody, modern Orthodoxy could have been part of it, but it chose not to go in that direction for unfortunate reasons. So that's my answer.
הרב רולי מטלון, בבקשה.
In the conference website, there is guidelines for defining Mas'oltiyut. They are in Hebrew and in English. And I read, these principles: tradition, non-denomination, commitment to family, parents, generations, togetherness, cultural diversity, traditional modernity, values, the Torah of life, halacha, and so on and so forth. Mas'oltiyut, universalism, Eretz Israel, social justice. And I look at this and I say, I know that if we put this out in the world and we say, come to the table. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be very intrigued and very interested and challenged by this proposal. This should not be something that is just, I want to come and sign. I want to come and study. I want to come and think about it. I may have to deepen some aspects of my Jewish experience that I have not been so careful about in terms, for example, of Jewish practice or Shabbat or social justice, or, so to see how different people can feel attracted and at the same time stretched, to be able to come to something like this, where there's more of a feeling of togetherness in the Jewish people rather than to be each in their own lane, as they say here, on their own track. So I would say, I think we have to put it out there and begin to talk to people. And I'm not here for creating another movement. I don't think we should create another movement. But this is a spirit. This is an approach to Jewish life and to the Jewish experience and to Jewish identity.
תודה. דוקטור מיכל ביטון.
Well, it's funny, the question, whose Ashkenazi leaders or organizations are doing this? I'm going to say something that might sound controversial here. I think Chabad in America actually represents a Masorati model. I don't mean Masorati in terms of the Middle East and Sephardic. I mean Masorati in terms of saying, come as you are. We are inclusive. We want to welcome you to share a Shabbat meal. We're not going to ask you what you think or how you practice at home. We're going to just help you belong to a community. And believe it or not, there's more and more rabbis and communities who are not Chabad, who are learning from the Chabad model, which I think is very similar to the Sephardic model, which is how do we create communities that are traditional, that you walk in and you don't just remember your grandmother's soup, but also her questions, right? You walk in, you feel the tradition, you feel included, you feel welcome, but it's not necessarily fully individualistic and pluralistic. It's not everybody just does whatever they want. We have a community, we have a collective. So there is a model. I see a lot of thirst by people who are tired of going to synagogues where all the sermons, never in Rouli's shul, but other shuls, where all the sermons are only about politics and not about the spirit, not about the collective, not about meaning. And there's a lot of thirst for saying, I want to belong, I want to be in a space where I feel included and where I feel like I have very, very deep ties to the past.
תודה. דוקטור יקיר אנגלנדר.
I want to answer the question about with whom we're going to work. For many years, the Israeli-American community and the Jewish-American communities were very separated. Because of both sides. There was judgment from both sides on each other, and as large the Israeli-American community was, we created a kibbutz in LA or in Florida, with no speaking with the American Jewish communities. And if it was a small one, we were forced to live together with the American Jewish communities. This is totally changed. And today with the IEC, one of our anchors of our work is a relationship with American Jewish communities. But we need to remember one thing. The streams of Judaism that we have today in America, the biggest one is the unaffiliated. And I think that there is something about our Israeliness and the way, and it's not about the politics of Israel. And it's not only about the Hebrew. I think there is something in Israeliness, also because we are living in the Middle East, that there is something about how our community run and live and speak and touch and cry and show feelings that many unaffiliated Jews want to be in a relationship with. And I think the beauty is that more and more that we are creating roundtables in each major city where we work and live, together with the major organizations, not only the religious ones, but together we think how we can live together. So I see huge potential for this relationship.
At the Anu Museum where I work, there is the Shderat Azramim, the denominations lane or streams lane. And I wasn't working there back then, but they were thinking, how can they write about the Masortiyim? Because the conservative movement translated itself in Hebrew to
התנועה המסורתית. So there is a linguistic problem there. So they ended up translating it into מסורתי by choice, which is, I think we should change it now. It should totally be מסורתי by default, right? Because you're just taking upon what was given to you and passing it forward, paying it forward, without really making something very dramatic or active in it. That's the power. We're gonna do our quick round of final statements, משפט סיכום, one thoughts you would like to share before we're wrapping this up. And we're going to start with יקיר.
I think that to say Israeli, to have the gift to be here with you is an adaptive change. And the fact that we can speak about Israel and Israeliness as part of the Masorti, and we don't have these definitions yet, which means that it's more elastic, it can change. I think it's a gift that I want to invite the listeners, the audience in Israel and our audience in America to reflect on. How we can take our Israeli identity or identities and to make it as a tool to bring the questions or to re-ask the questions. And I want to end with, if it's okay, with one little example. A lot of the Jewish questions that we are asking today about the Jewish world, we still use halachic terms. And I think that it's important, but many times when we ask who is Jewish and we think about halakha, or how to deal with LGBTQ and we think with halakha terms, we're also missing something deeply by using these concepts. And I think there is something about the Israeli Massortiyut that don't deal many times with halakha that is going to bring so much richness to our Jewish life.
תודה רבה יקיר. מיכל, closing sentence.
Just really grateful for this, and I hope that this is the beginning of a conversation that we continue to have and that we lean into the difficult questions in order to grow together.
תודה. הרב רולי?
Thank you very much. Also, I am very grateful to be part of this conversation in this panel, and just to see the different approach that the four of us on the panel have is really wonderful to see. I mean, we're all united and we're all together. We all have different paths. One last thing I want to share is that I think that something that was not on the table today is that Israel has become a very divisive subject here in the American Jewish community, between traditional communities and liberal communities, left-leaning, right-leaning. And I hope that Masortiyut and the Israeli Masortiyut can come and help us heal this very big rift and the disconnection of so many young people, particularly on the left and in liberal communities from Israel. I think Masortiyut may have a role to play in this respect. It's something that maybe we'll leave for another conversation, but I want to put it on the table before I close. And thank you so much for having me.
Okay. At the last word. Okay. I think it's very clear to anybody who understands the sociology of United States Judaism that denominationalism is a thing of the past. It's basically failed, and the denominations are shrinking in terms of numbers, in terms of members, and that's a failed model. I think in Israel, the Ben Gurion's Kul HaHituch was a failure as well. And I think both in the United States and here in Israel, Sephardic Judaism, Sfaradiyut, Masortiyut, call it what you will, both were suppressed. It's not, Sephardic Judaism is not the narrative of United States Jewry. And it's not the narrative here in Israel as well, because Sfaradim have to define themselves and dress in certain ways and think certain ways in order to fit into the existing paradigms that the state of Israel has established. Those, I think, I hope, and I pray, are models of the past, and this is time for Masortiyut, Sephardic Masortiyut, general Masortiyut, to emerge as the next phase for all of Am Yisrael. That's why it was important for me to be part of this panel and to even come here to Israel to be part of it, because this is a very, very special and critical moment for the Jewish people. Denominationalism and boxed categories here should go, and this should eventually emerge as the model for Am Yisrael.
Thank you to our very inspiring speakers, not just for being here today, but also for the work you do for our people. I want to sum up by saying that in our world today, discourse about identity and belonging it became very toxic. And it takes us to two very different edges that it's even more blunt in the US. The first one is dogmatic, monolithic, even aggressive kind of dealing with identity. The other end is apologetic. It's detaching, as opting out from any serious and heavy managing of an identity. And I think in this context, Masורתיות is offering a third way, very integrative, complete, easygoing, balanced way to deal with your identity and belonging. So thank you for that. I absolutely think it's one of the answers to the biggest challenges that the Jewish people is facing today as a people, as communities, as families, and as individuals. I want to invite Yair to sum up this panel.
יש לי בעיקר, I mainly have just one word to say really, תודה רבה, רבה, רבה. Thank you very much for this fascinating process, not only the panel, but the process that I think that you could feel that we had. This isn't just bringing interesting people together to answer interesting questions with Naama's great leadership here. It's really the process that we started and hopefully will continue. I hope it's just the beginning. I think that I started inspired and I'm even more inspired after, and then Rav Daniel that came, especially for 2 days from Los Angeles. Deserves another. I hope it was worth it. As תודה רבה, I think it really expresses this effort expresses, I think, our feeling that there's something really that is happening here. I want to thank Sivan Levi that conducted and directed all this process in the last year and also until these last minutes. תודה רבה, Sivan. And we started the process when she was single and now she's married. So I think hopefully this also was part of the blessing. Something good happened. And as Sivan also Rabbi Mטלון mentioned in our website, look it up, also in Hebrew and also in English, there are these principles that started last year and are continuous, and it's not something fixed, it's something that continuous, is writing itself continuously, but I think these principles, it's worthwhile to go to the website and to read them, English or Hebrew. I think it will resonate in what we spoke here, and it's also a place from where we can continue. תודה רבה, נעמה, על ההנחיה, on this, conducting this, and I'm moving to Hebrew, ב7:15, אנחנו בפאנל האחרון, המסכם של שלושת הימים האלה, עם פרופסור מאיר בוזגלו, בין השאר, ועוד, כן, זה קורה פה בצריף, הפאנל המסכם של כל הכנס, ולאחר מכן תהיה הופעה באודיטוריום.